today where conservatives and liberals disagree to agree.
Welcome to Coffee with Creamer, where you get to sit down with our host, Dr. Barry Creamer, for a conversation about faith, life, and culture. We'll look at old ideas through a new lens, turn those culture wars on their head, and paint a picture of the way things could be. If you like your thinking deep and your coffee hot, pull up a chair. You're in the right place.
We have such a sharp division in our culture right now, in our society right now, that it seems there is just no bringing the two sides together. And you hear about it as a divergence. You know what I mean by that? A convergence where curves are coming together, a divergence where the curves are spreading apart. You hear about this as a divergence in our society, that there is this insoluble problem, that there is this rift that's going to continue to grow until the West Coast falls off of the United States and no one is ever to be recovered, and good riddance. You hear it all kinds of ways. And all of those are obviously hyperbolic. They're exaggerations, but there is a sincerity behind it as well. And if for the divide to be that significant is saying something about where our society is right now that we have to deal with. What I find interesting and compelling in the reality of that division is that the opposite sides unknowingly actually do agree. And I don't mean in a slight way. I mean in a fundamental way. The only reason these two sides are able to disagree, I disagree on a lot of these issues with different people. The only reason we're able to disagree the way we do is because we have a common ground. We meet on a common field of battle, and it's recognizing that foundation, that common field of battle, where we both put our cleats down and dig into the ground and say, but I have this territory, that we actually come to blows, come to these disagreements that are so significant. And so what I want to do, and this will take more than one episode, so I'm sorry for that. I wish we could do everything in 40 minutes and resolve all of the conflicts of the world. But the reality is it will take more than one episode, I think, to do this. I want to come to an understanding of how these opposite sides actually do agree. And I don't mean by that they agree on the policies. Obviously, there's disagreement about policy or the way we should think about certain issues. But why we disagree actually reveals a whole lot more in common between us than the division that is between us. And it doesn't mean these problems would go away, but it does mean we could meet at a point where we could actually begin a discussion on common ground. And that's the point of every discussion, every argument that's made, not dispute, but argument, every logical case given by offering sentences, premises in defense of a conclusion that you want to draw. It's all based on some point of agreement that we have to have. If we don't have that, there's nothing. And we do have it. So, I mean, when we're talking about SOGI issues, as we refer to them, sexual orientation, gender identity issues, the LGBTQ plus movement is on one side of this field, and then there's this traditionalist view on the other side, traditional marriage and so on like that. If we're talking about race, on one side are the people with Black Lives Matters and calling for reparations, and on the other side are, and you will not necessarily agree with the way I categorize this, but it is correct, and it is one of the categories that's on the opposite side of the Black Lives Matters and reparations kind of discussion, and that's the Integrationists. For a lot of people who say, well, there's no more race problem, what they mean is, well, we don't have desegregation anymore. And so we can talk about that issue in more detail another time, but there are opposite sides on the race issue. There is another opposite side. There are white supremacists, and there are people who view their own group as the only people who are actually fully human and things like that. But those are so extreme. I mean, these people who really have an influence in our society. And there are extreme views in the society, but they're usually extreme closer toward the middle of these two sides. On race, Black Lives Matters or reparationists or people who are calling for reparations, I mean. And then on the other side, the integrationists, which are again, that's a topic for another day. But, talking about economics, by the way, it's the same way. You've got people who are on the side of the New Deal, Great Society, the new socialists right now, the people who love Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, is that her name? Anyway, you know who it is. AOC is all you ever hear. So there are the people who love her, and then there are the people who are on the opposite side and view that as the demise of society, the John Galt capitalists or the Hayek free marketers. And what I'm saying about all of these groups, including the next one that I'll mention, is that we actually have a lot more in common than we realize. And it's not, I don't mean by that just that, we can all share flowers and sit down and have a meal together. I mean the foundation to the arguments that we're forming, to the cases that we're making, are actually in agreement with each other. We value the same ultimate thing, or we wouldn't be building the arguments off of them. And that's what I want to get to in these probably 2 episodes where we'll talk about this. On abortion, it's the same way. The feminist pro-choice voices on one side, and then the religious pro-life voices on the other side. I know not everybody who's pro-life is religious, but it does dominate the discussion. And I know that not everyone who's pro-choice is necessarily feminist. They are feminist in one sense, not necessarily pejorative sense, but in one sense. But they're certainly not necessarily anti-religious. That's just not the case. So, but on abortion, on both sides, the pro-choice, pro-life sides, there is a commonality or common ground. So, but you say, well, just don't beat around the bush. Just tell us what it is. Well, I could, but it would not mean anything because I find, and this is a frustration in one sense, but it's also an open door, an opportunity for us to learn in the other sense. I just find that most people don't even know the categories, understand what the categories are about down the line that I'm going to be talking about. And so I want to lay some foundation for it and help us arrive there in a more meaningful sense so that it's not just some foisting some commonality on a truly divergent curve in our society, but instead actually revealing why we have the arguments that we do, why we have the differences, the disparities that we do, but also what we share in common in the process that ought to give us ground for a meaningful, rational discussion. Not saying that emotions can't play a part in it, but you have to, at some point, you have to be able to sit down and say, well, you think this, don't you? And have a rational conversation about it. And I think we can get there. So here are some basic concepts that we have to recognize. And now I'm just going to, the 2 big ones are things that I mention all of the time, but I don't spend a lot of time on them repeatedly. And so the 2 big divisions among societies, how societies function, and these are not mutually exclusive in every individual. And not any society is 100% one way or the other way in every behavior. But societies do very strongly and clearly divide into one of these 2 types. There are more communal societies, societies that are organized communally, and then there are societies that are organized individually around the individual. And among the communal societies, there is this sense that we're all moving toward a common purpose, toward a common end, toward a common The technical word for it is a telos. It's a Greek word that means end or purpose. And so when you've heard the name, if you've heard of arguments about the existence of God, and you've heard of the teleological argument, it's based on this word, the argument from ends, because things look like they were designed to achieve an end. There must have been an intelligence that put that design in them so that they would achieve that end. That's the teleological argument. I'm just giving you the word telos so you get the sense of what that word is about. In communal societies, there is a shared telos. That's what helps them be communal in their nature. It's what helps people share in their values and their means and everything that they're doing to arrive at this common conclusion. And in societies that are working toward that kind of common purpose or end, there are some values that rise above all the other values, and they are normally, and I'm not inventing this, sociologists have said this for decades and have observed it, have studied it in different kinds of societies. And if I were to pick, by the way, a source that really makes it obvious to me, and I've mentioned this source on the air before, it's a book that had a lot of influence on me when I first read it. It's Ian Barber's Religion in an Age of Science, or now it's Science and Religion. So we've mentioned that before, and we've linked to it before on our website, barrycreamer.com, if you want to go back and look at other episodes and get a chance to review what that material was about. But it's a big part of why I understand this division as well. By the way, not just that, but also other authors, Catherine Albanese and the books that she writes on religion in America, have a very significant seminal influence on the way that I think about these sociological issues. Again, I don't embrace either of those authors' ultimate or core values. I'm not saying I agree with all of the conclusions that they draw, but their insights, especially about the sociology of it, about why societies function the way they do and things have moved culturally and historically the way they have, are brilliant and have really helped me to get a grasp on the things that are going on in the world. So I just want to mention those up front and say that in more communal societies, the fact that we share a set of common values and outcomes means that there is a very significant emphasis on honor. Because if you're a person who is contributing to the society's movement forward toward the end, then you are honored among all of your friends. And it's not a matter of the way we would think of it as individualists, especially. It's not a matter of some kind of arrogant pride to be thrust in front of everyone else and given this glory and this recognition. And in fact, glory kind of goes along with honor in some ways in these contexts as well. And by the way, the supreme thing to avoid in those societies that's similar to honor, but along that same axis, is shame. You do not want to be a person who loses face, so to speak, or is shamed by your society, shunned by your society in some way. The whole value set of a communal society, this is not hard to figure out. I mean, it's sort of in the definition, it's intrinsic to it, is belonging, that you belong. You belong to that community. You belong to that society. And what you lose when you don't belong anymore is devastating. And so being honored puts you right at the center of it, and being shamed excludes you from it. And so the punishments that you experience, the most negative things that you encounter in that kind of a society where things are defined communally, would be exile or exclusion of some kind, or excommunication, whichever term and style you want to put on it. It's that. Having been shunned in some way is the worst possible thing that could happen to you. On the opposite of that are societies that are organized around individuals. Now, I'm trying to just brush through this really quickly, and you can tell by how long it's taking just to hit the highlight how complex the topic can be. But I do want to assure you of this. These may not be things you think about all the time. A lot of people do. Some of you are going to be familiar with this already. But if you start to think, oh, man, this is going to become so complicated, we can't do it, it's actually not that complicated. It's just unfamiliar. And if you'll just walk with me down this road, you will see when we get to the other end that we really are all standing on the same field, making our argument from the same original position, and trying to draw these conclusions that we think will blow our counterparts out of the water. They won't be able to hold their ground. And in reality, they're on the ground for the same reason. that we're on the ground. So I'm not saying that because of that, we would come to the same conclusions, but I am saying we can have a meaningful discussion because of it. So hang with me for a little bit if you can. I know this will sound a little complex as we're approaching it, but right now we're just saying there are two kinds of societies historically and even in contemporary times. There are two different kinds of societies. Some are communal, some are individually oriented. And by the way, in an individually oriented society, in a society that's focused on individualism, we work toward the agreement. This is an ironic thing because remember, in a communal society, we work toward a common purpose or end. But in an individualistic society, we work toward the agreement that we do not have to share a purpose. That's the whole point of individualism. You choose the thing you want to pursue, I choose the thing I want to pursue, and what we agree on is that we give space to each other to pursue our own ends. And that itself is the point of agreement. So we work toward the agreement that we don't have to share a purpose. Now that's tricky because some people have purposes that contradict other people's purposes. If somebody has the purpose that no one should ever take drugs, and somebody else has the purpose that they want to stay stoned all the time, then you're going to have an immediate conflict, and you have to decide, well, how do we come to an agreement about how our different ends can be realized? And that's the whole trick to social contract theory and all these other ideas that we'll have to deal with. In societies that are focused on individualism, the supreme values are not like they are in a communal society, where it was honor and achieving honor and a sense of belonging in your community. In an individualistic society, the supreme values are self-esteem, that you yourself, and people put this in all kinds of different terms for completely different reasons, that you self-actualize is the most important achievement you could have, that you yourself love yourself, that you trust yourself, that you believe in yourself, that you don't experience the opposite of high self-esteem, which would be guilt, self-loathing, self-rejection of some kind. That is, and this is why we have so many people committed, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing. Look, I am not picking one of these approaches and saying we ought to be this or we ought to be that. The truth of the matter is we are all committed to both sides of this equation. We just don't recognize it, and our society focuses on one side or the other. Communal societies lose something because they don't focus on individuals. Individualistic societies lose something because they don't focus on community. So don't read ahead of me and think that I'm picking sides here. Oh, if we could just be more focused on the way communal societies function, then we'd be great. No, I always respond to that by saying, yeah, but I don't want to go back to the Spanish Inquisition because we had a common agreement under the Spanish Inquisition, and that didn't go anywhere good. I know it's exaggerated what it was and how it happened and all that kind of historical stuff, but it's a great illustration to make the point anyway, so we'll go with that. So anyway, as I'm talking about individualism and I say this, I'm not just mocking the value of self-esteem. There's something critically important about self-esteem and understanding how God builds in us a conscience so that we can actually answer directly. Every one of us shall give account of himself to God. Those statements are biblical statements from Isaiah and Paul and so on. So I'm not mocking that or degrading it in any way. But those two types of societies are fundamentally different. They diverge in the world. The same way we diverge on opinions about some of these policy issues that we talk about in our own culture. So if you understand those two types of societies, they are so divergent, so obviously, once you've recognized it, once you've worked with it a little bit, and I have over a period of decades, it becomes really obvious when you're talking to someone, whether they are part of a society that's more focused on individualism or on communitarian obligations. Just as a really brief example to make the point for this first episode, so I taught for 8 years. I taught a lot of philosophy classes at Texas Woman's University in Denton. Great school, loved being there, loved teaching there. I'm a preacher, so but I have a PhD in humanities in the areas of philosophy and history. So I can teach philosophy at a secular institution. I love doing it. that I'm respectful of all the people who are there, but I'm never unclear about who I am. I would spend time arguing the ontological argument and so on. But I loved being there because I was given space to teach freely. And in classes where we had a wide variety, and we always had a wide variety of students, for instance, I would have students from India. And I remember twins who were from India, and they were really good students. I'm not giving their names, so I'm not violating FERPA for those who are listening and are involved in higher education. So anyway, I asked these twins, what are your plans? To write a paper. They had to write a paper. And in response, they wrote papers on marriage. And one of them was getting married based on falling in love while she was here in the United States and blah, blah, blah. And the other one was getting married, going back to India to marry a person who had been arranged for her to marry that she didn't even know personally when she was writing the paper. And she wrote about how unjust it was that she would have to do that and that she would never expect her children to do the same thing. But she, as soon as she graduated, would go back to India, submit to her parents, and marry that person. And I'm reading these two papers from twins in this class who took it from India. One who was going to marry out of love, one who was going into an arranged marriage. And I just could not, it was almost unfathomable because I had not gone far into understanding the difference between the two sets of values, but she was recognizing that the most moral thing she could do in that moment, the one who was going to go back for the arranged marriage, that the most moral thing she could do in that moment was respect the wishes of her family and her community, her village at that point. Her family and her village over her personal choices, that was her way of experiencing the full maturity of her moral obligations. And that was so different than the way, and I'll just put it directly in our lap, the way Americans think about how you experience the full maturity of your moral experience, which we experience by standing against everyone else. I alone on this rock am willing to face the winds of temptation and trial and say, no, my conviction says otherwise. And I'll give more detail to that in a moment. But that really forced me to recognize that there are values in a communitarian society that are so fundamentally different than the way we think that I needed to learn more about it. And so I spent time studying and learning more about it. And in those among communitarian societies, there are a couple of options. One, there are ancient societies. So anybody before about 1500. So the end of the Renaissance, beginning of the Enlightenment period, that's the period where individualism develops even as an option. There's no real option for it before that. So anything you read, I don't care if it's Augustine or Aquinas, it doesn't matter if it's a Greek author or a Roman author, it doesn't matter if it's Asian or African, it's communitarian because there is no legitimate individualistic option before about 1500. So historically, when you look at societies, you're going to find examples of communitarian values, of this sense that the community is the whole point of our existence, that belonging is the highest priority in our existence. And we find that everywhere. I'll talk more about it in just a moment. But in ancient Greek city-states, so the polis of the ancient Greeks, there are perfect examples of this. They didn't share values between the city-states. I mean, some did. But, there were huge differences between Sparta and Athens, for instance. No doubt about it. And yet within the city-state, which was the political unit of their day, within the city-state, there was agreement on basic values. They were communitarian. I'm not talking about what they were. We're not going to go all the way down that road. But just as an example, if you've ever read the Iliad, and I don't think we've talked about this on any of the episodes we've had, but if you've ever read the Iliad, you know that Achilles, in the opening of it, and even if you've watched one of the movies about it, sometimes you have to set up the crisis, the dilemma at the beginning of the Iliad, which is that here we're going to war against Troy. We have the greatest warrior ever, Achilles, who can defeat anyone, anytime, anywhere. And he's sitting in his tent, refusing to fight, while all of his friends and fellow warriors are being slaughtered by the Trojans. Why is he sitting in his tent? And the answer is that he had a woman who he had captured in a previous battle that Agamemnon had taken from him. Agamemnon's the great king. He's the great leader, and everybody's supposed to follow Agamemnon. So Agamemnon can do whatever he wants, and he takes the woman from Achilles, and Achilles sulks in his tent. And if you read the Iliad, you read him whining like a small child about not having that woman that he had taken in battle because Agamemnon has taken her from him, and I'm just not going to fight. And it sounds so petty to an individualist, to a person who thinks the way we think. But in their society, what he had lost and what he expresses in the Iliad that he lost was honor. He had been shamed. He had been pushed aside by Agamemnon. And he said, until my honor is restored, I cannot fight in the battle, even to the demise of many of those who were fighting with him. That looks so petty to us. It's really hard to retell the story of the Iliad and have people take it seriously because we don't respect that perspective. We don't recognize what's actually going on with it, the challenge to Achilles' honor and his shame that he's experiencing. And if you want to bring one closer to home, if you're a believer, if you read Scripture and you know it, in the Levant, in Israel, in that region of Israel, in that same ancient time, the same kind of thing is being experienced about the same time, by the way, when David's messengers, when he sends off messengers to Ammon, and they're received roughly, and they have half of their beards shaved off and half their clothes cut off and all that stuff. And so they return so ashamed. David says, oh, no, you don't have to come back and be seen publicly. You can stay over there and not be seen until your beards grow back. We read that like, what on earth? Just shave the other half of your face and you'll be okay. We lose our hair, you just shave your head. It's all right. It is a huge deal for them to have been shamed instead of received with the honor a king's messenger should have been received with. It is shame to David, shame to his messengers. And because we don't think in those terms of what it is to be shunned or to be excluded, we just don't, it doesn't register with us as making sense. But it makes perfect sense to them. And so as we're reading stories like that, we become a little more familiar with how grounded historically these communal types of values are. By the way, if you take steps forward historically through the Middle Ages, for instance, then the thing that unifies us around a community is bigger than a village, bigger than a city-state. It's the Holy Roman Church, and we're united around the beatific vision. And it's not a very good unity. Like a lot of places where there's sort of a blend of different values at the same time. The Holy Roman Church doesn't do a great job of getting everybody to live according to the same means to achieve that end. But the thing that joins us together is this beatific vision, the blessing of seeing God in eternity, the blessing that comes with that. And so that's historically, that's the grounding for the communal type of society. But there are others than historical societies. There are contemporary societies that are completely communal in their nature. A lot of Asian societies are communal in their nature. Hence, the expression that I was using earlier, and not to use a caricature, but just an expression that most of us are familiar with that's used, of losing face in some Asian nations. That idea that you would be shamed seems really important in how you do business transactions and how you greet people and all that kind of stuff in a way that makes us think, wow, how petty are these people? They're not petty. They have a different sense of how important it is that you learn how to yield to the community's set of values and to respect the direction that whole community goes together. The idea of having, for us, the idea of having a huge company, Facebook, take all their employees out in the courtyard and everybody's going to do calisthenics together. Everybody's going to say their morning prayers together. We would be creeped out by things like that. And I'm not saying things like that don't happen here, but we're creeped out when we hear things like that. Not uncommon at all in other societies where thoughts are more communal and where the sense of belonging and our identity being wrapped up in who we belong to is much more important. So contemporary societies, especially Asian and African societies, as I have encountered them in people here, Not like I've traveled all over Asia or all over Africa, so I am in my own anecdotal experiences confirming that this is the case. But authors, sociologists recognize this as well, Asian, African especially, countries. There are certainly blends in between. But even in contemporary societies, there are communal societies. When you look at the other half and you say, well, yeah, but who are the individualists? Where are the individualistic societies? Those are Western, and they are transatlantic Western since the Enlightenment, so after 1500 or so. Once you get past that point and you're in Western society, so pretty much Western Europe and the United States, North America and parts of South America, and it's sort of blended in South America for a lot of different reasons, then you have this individualistic sort of society. And the evidence of that is most apparent in the United States. And I only say it's most intensely held in the United States for lots of historical reasons that go beyond where we can go right now. But, two little points of evidence of that are the emphasis we put on the right to privacy. There were no qualms 20 years ago about putting cameras everywhere in London so that no matter what you were doing, the police could come and look and see who was there and who might have perpetrated this crime and so on like that. And when they were doing that in England, here we were, oh, no way on earth are we putting cameras everywhere and allowing everybody to be seen. Now that we have found a way to do it, we haven't done it by saying, oh, yeah, the government can put cameras anywhere in every neighborhood, on every light post. But instead, we've talked ourselves into doing it as individuals by putting Ring cameras on everybody's doors. And you have to volunteer to do it. And we don't even like that very much because you have to actively opt in to share your video with the police so that they can keep an eye on every nook and cranny of every neighborhood all of the time. We really don't like the idea of Big Brother spying on us. That's unique to the United States. I'm not saying people love it everywhere, but I am saying the idea that we have a right for no one to be able to see what I'm doing when I'm walking down the street is to the United States. That's us. It's not everybody else. I'm not saying it doesn't exist anywhere, but it is nowhere like it is here. The same thing, and the same thing with the free church movement. That emerges here. That you're just going to pick and choose what church you're going to go to, that you would not have a national church that you could identify with. Even if you neglect it to the point of secularism, you've still got an Anglican church in England. That's who they are. That idea for us is just absurd. We would never think to do that. And I know some of you are thinking, I don't know, we've gotten pretty close. Nah, we have not. And the fact that we even think we've gotten close is testimony to how far we are from it. But that's a point for another discussion as well. Okay. All of that, this individualism in Western society, and especially in the United States and in Western Europe, all of that emerges from all of these ideas, and you can see it developing in all of these ideas that are trying to find a way to explain what ties us together, what helps us work together. How do we recognize a common set of values if we don't require everybody to desire the same ultimate value? You don't even have to believe in God to be a part of this free society. So how are we tied together? Social contract theory addresses that. The whole idea behind social contract theory is to try to figure out what could bind together a bunch of free radicals. Radicals meaning they can go different directions than where you would think everybody else is going to go. Utilitarianism as an ethic. Even if you don't know what it is, just hang with me long enough. The ends justifies the means. The idea is that we're promoting, maximizing happiness among individuals, that kind of idea. That idea to maximize happiness among individuals, that the whole concept of utilitarianism is built on the idea that everybody's happiness might be different. And so the utilitarian question is, how do we arrive at a point where we can maximize the happiness for all those individuals who may have different expressions of what the happiness is, but they're all trying to get to happiness? When we were living in the pre-Enlightenment world, that historical community world that I was talking about, we were looking for how to maximize individuals' participation in the happiness that was agreed upon by the society as a whole. Completely different goal in mind. These are fundamentally different outcomes, different goals that societies have in mind. And it doesn't happen overnight. I'm not pretending the United States emerges with the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, which is an Enlightenment, individualistic, rights-based document. It is all of that. And the Constitution, which is given to us in the Bill of Rights to defend those individual liberties. That's what the Bill of Rights is all about. All of that's true. And yet it still takes another almost 100 years till you get to, well, it's a little more than 100 years after the Declaration of Independence before you finally arrive at something like Huck Finn, Mark Twain's Huck Finn, where you actually have an expression of individualism that's so powerful that you can see. I'm not saying he causes it, but I'm saying he reveals that the thought, the way of thinking in the United States after the Civil War is actually compelled toward individualism over the communitarian value set that we were still sharing, even though we were trying to build an individualistic society. If that seems complicated, think of it this way. If you know the story of Huck Finn, super simple, and I'm not including all the little side stories that lead down to this, but the core of the story is one moment and one line where Huck has to decide which way he's going to go on a moral dilemma. He has one of two options. He's either going to obey the religious and civil authorities, the community that he belongs to. He's either going to obey the religious and civil authorities who make it clear that he's got to hand Jim over. He's got to turn him in. He's got to return Jim to where he's going to be a slave. That's the obligation he's got, and there's no doubt that's what he has to do. Or he has to obey his personal sense, his conscience, his personal sense of friendship with Jim. The fact that Jim helped him down the river and all those things that he did for him, building that friendship. And in so doing, betray the community, the church and the state. So he's either got to be true to his own conscience or he's got to obey the commands of the community that's around him. And the whole brilliance, and not the whole brilliance, I mean, that novel is absolutely supreme among American novels. And almost anybody would say that with you. And there are plenty of authors who afterwards say, everything we're writing after Huck Finn is an attempt to be like that. It's that powerful a book. It's not Tom Sawyer, believe me. So when you read Huck Finn, the whole point is to come to this conclusion where Huck Finn, his redemption comes from his choosing in that moral dilemma his own conscience over the community, where he chooses the individual's moral obligation over the sense of obligation that the community is giving to him. And in so doing, he pronounces condemnation on his own soul. He says, all right, then I'll go to H-E double toothpicks. I know, because I don't know who's listening, and I want your kids to be able to listen if they need to listen, whatever. But you get he says it profoundly as a condemnation on himself, but that statement is his moment of redemption. That's the irony of the whole book, that it comes to that moral dilemma, and by rejecting the church's authority, by rejecting the community's obligations, he actually fulfills the one great moral obligation that's so obvious to anybody who's reading the book, which is for him to be faithful to Jim, for him to answer to his own conscience instead. I've addressed this in classes a number of times, and we'll talk about that in a different episode another time, and ask this question, about whether you would follow your own conscience or if you would follow the moral obligations you have for your family. Among Americans, the answer is always universal. If you're going to do the right thing, you always have to follow your own conscience. You never give up your moral conviction for the sake of the community. Among Asians and Africans, I get the opposite answer. And I mean people from directly, right now, Asia and Africa. They view it completely differently, and they view that moral dilemma as an opportunity for you to grow up, to become mature by rejecting your own sense of what's right and wrong, to accept what is more important, the community's set of obligations that are upon you. That whole approach to things changes how we understand the world. By the way, that's a very strong form of emotivism, is a name that can be given to it. And there are others. Existentialism, we can talk about it another day. There are historically examples that we can give in Scripture, which I want to do. I want to talk about in Scripture how a communal sense of obligation is part of our essence as human beings. I also want to talk about how in Scripture and historically in other examples, that individual accountability to God, standing alone, bowing your own knee before God, is also a fundamental part of who we are. I want to talk about all of those things, and I want to come back and talk about why, whether it's the SOGI movement or talking about race or the economy or abortion, people who are on both sides are actually having to address that divide in our community and individual interests, and we're choosing both sides of it in different issues. And we're choosing different sides among ourselves on those issues. I want to come back and talk about all of that because of this. Every argument, every time we make a logical case for something, I mentioned this earlier. This is where I'll stop on this episode. Every argument, every logical case we make for something is based on finding common ground. If you're going to make a case for something with someone, you have to start by saying, well, you think this, don't you? Well, if you think that, then this and this and this, and then you draw the conclusion. And they may still say, well, I don't like the conclusion, but you say, but you do agree with the premise, right? And if they say no, then you back up a little further until you find something they do agree with. It's built on that. And what we will find is that there is common ground at the foundation of arguments by SOGI, free market, race, and pro-life advocates. But we're not there yet. So consider this just part one of probably two parts on our way to a place where we can begin seeking peace instead of just more conflict.
Thanks for joining us for Coffee with Creamer. Your cup of coffee may be finished, but we are not. Come back next week for a refill as we sit down to examine a new set of ideas and cultural issues. Don't miss an episode. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts or visit our website at barrycreamer.com. Until next time, keep your mug hot and your mind sharp.